I will introduce our panellists. So, John McKinnon, who may be sitting closest to me. John McKinnon is a former New Zealand diplomat and senior public servant. Fran O'Sullivan will be known to many, an editorial director of business for NZME, and Charles Finny, partner at Saunders Unsworth and former New Zealand diplomat. And you can, when you read their biographies in the program, you'll see that they all have significant experience here. We are somewhat compressed on time, so I'll jump straight into this. I'm going to start with you, John. You first went to China, or maybe Greater China, Hong Kong, I believe in the early 1970s. Mid-1970s, right, correction noted. But do you want to kick off with your brief comments and then we'll get into the discussion?
Well, thank you, Matt. Kia ora tātou, and it's a great pleasure to be here and to have a chance to talk about, China mostly, but obviously the session is broader than that. As Matt has so sensitively reminded me, I did first go to China in the mid-1970s. Some of you may remember that period of time, some of you may not. But I want to take you back just a little bit further, which is to December 1972, 50 years ago in December, which was when New Zealand established diplomatic relations with the People's Republic of China. And I think that it's fair to say that in doing that, there was a recognition that it was very hard for New Zealand to operate in the Asia-Pacific region, or the Indo-Pacific region as we often now call it, without having some sort of direct relationship with the people in Beijing, which had in fact been the fact where there had been no such relationship between 1949 and 1972. So that was a big part of it. Now, obviously, there was also, New Zealand being New Zealand, a desire that we would benefit economically from that relationship. Now, there were people in Europe who would say, if only I could sell one sock to China, one sock to every person in China, I'd be doing well. I don't know why they never say two socks, but anyway, it always seems to be one sock. The New Zealand equivalent of that was the person in the 1940s who said, if only we could sell one pat of butter to each person in China, we'd be doing really well. Well, we've come actually quite close to that, but that was not the case in 1972, 1973. In fact, it took a while for the economic or commercial benefits of that relationship to make themselves felt. And the point I want to make is that at the end of the day, it was about the need to have a political relationship with China, which drove that decision in 1972, and I think that's still a very valid point now. Now, rolling the clock forward to when I was in Beijing, which was in 1978 to 80, 1978, the end of 1978 was when Deng Xiaoping returned to power in China for about the third or fourth time. And he started a new policy, a new external policy for China, because China had been very conscious over the past 100 years or so that it had been somehow outsmarted by a lot of other countries, and it had experimented with many different ways of trying to deal with this. But basically, Deng Xiaoping said, well, the only way we can deal with this is to integrate China with the rest of the world economically. And he set on a path of doing that, and that is what we are now seeing today, the fruits of that decision, which was taken in December 1978, although I doubt that even Deng Xiaoping himself really realised what this was all going to lead to. But one thing that was very clear he did not see it leading to was political liberalisation. So shortly after what was called at that time the third plenum, which set the new path for China, there were demonstrations in Beijing calling for the fifth modernisation. So the other four modernisations were, I think, agriculture, industry, science, technology, national defence. The fifth one was to be democracy. And Deng Xiaoping made it very clear that he was not interested in that. In other words, he was not interested in modifying the overarching position that the Communist Party of China has in that polity. And it's worth bearing that in mind because that has also continued to be very much a part of what China's been all about since that period in the 1970s, but even before. Deng's policies, of course, produced an enormous increase in wealth in China. People argue now about whether, basically how many people were lifted out of poverty. Maybe it's 600 million, maybe it's 700 million. They argue about how many people are in the middle class in China. Is it 200 million? Is it 300 million? Well, if you're not very sure whether it's 200 or 300, all you do know is it's a lot of people. When we think of our own country and our own population, it sort of rather dwarfs it. From our point of view, the significance of that was that a lot of these people were interested in purchasing the goods and services that this country produces so well. And to cap that off, in 2008, we had the free trade agreement with China, which was upgraded last year, and it's just about to reach its final conclusion on the 1st of January next year. And that has also led to a massive increase in the Chinese economic interaction with New Zealand. So in 2023, we're in a very different world from the world that we started off in 1972. And one of the other, of course, huge differences in 2023 compared with 1972 is a change in the geopolitics. So in 1972, of course, this was in the wake of the Nixon-Kissinger opening to China. A lot of it was about a collective view that other countries, including the United States and China, wanted to check the Soviet Union. Now, whatever we may say about the situation now, it is certainly not that. And there are a lot of reasons why things have changed, and I don't want to go into those. But what I will say is that for a country such as ours, it is really very challenging to have a circumstance in which two of our major partner countries, the United States and China, have limited, if not zero, trust in each other, which means that anything which happens, and I'm not an expert on balloons, and I don't want to talk about balloons, but for anything which happens, it's interpreted in the most negative way possible. And that, I have to say, applies on both sides. So this is a very tricky situation for a country such as New Zealand, because our interests lie in both those places. And it's often said that, you know, we have an economic relationship with China and a security political relationship with the United States. I would say it's a little more complicated than that, because on the one hand, the United States is a big market for us. We sell a lot of things there. We do very well there. On the other hand, the Chinese certainly expect an economic relationship to be built on a very sound foundation of a political relationship. So the two are not exactly contrasting. If anything, they have elements of a similar kind with one another. We have to find a way of working through that, and it was just alluded to at the end of the previous session, that, you know, navigating, well, this is the theme, isn't it? Navigating is the way we have to go ahead. But let's not imagine it's going to be easy, and let's not imagine that it's going to finish anytime soon. I think the circumstance we are looking at geopolitically now is probably going to be with us for a couple of decades at least. And we will have to constantly be thinking about how we manage those things. And in terms of our relationship with China, there are pluses. Obviously, China is a big voice in the world and in the region. It's a massive market for us. There's a big Chinese presence now in New Zealand. But there are also obviously areas where we disagree very much, whether that's things which happen domestically in China or things which happen internationally. So finding our way through that is not going to be straightforward, but it's a task that we will have to deliver on, and we will have to continue doing so for quite some years. Thank you.
Kia ora. Yeah. And a great, I guess, zoom back into some of the recent historical context as well as the current moment. Thank you. Fran.
Yeah, I'm going to, it's a real cascade of reckons over today, much of which also impinges on China. I want to talk about what I perceive right now as sort of an era of new pragmatism in China. And we've had, you know, the period of COVID, we've had China kind of withdrawing from the world, Xi Jinping, who did an amazing amount of international trips as president, basically stayed home for the best part of 3 years. But now, you know, at the end of last year, once he'd been endorsed by the National Congress, he'd put in place a clean sweep of the Politburo, brought onto the Politburo people like Wang Yi, the Foreign Affairs Minister, who is now kind of a super diplomat right at the centre of international affairs in China. And he went ahead, he signalled COVID was going to be, all restrictions lifted, the borders were going to come down. And this after a very, very painstaking period of a very sheltered China. It was actually quite a shock at how quickly it has actually moved. And we've seen this period with massive acceleration of interest by investment bankers, all sorts of people. The Asia Financial Forum up in Hong Kong this year was deeply, deeply optimistic in January about what lied ahead after the period of negativity around China. In our immediate backyard, Penny Wong, the Foreign Affairs Minister from Australia, she managed to get a meeting with Wang Yi. You saw the Albanese government and Beijing start to take very small steps, but towards getting to a period where the coercive measures China had taken against Australia, and largely from a really ridiculous comment made by Maurice Payne, wanting to have an inquiry into the origins of COVID right at the time when China was just grappling with the bug itself. And so she was the foreign minister. Things, became very, very difficult. New Zealand managed to steer its way around that without getting too far embroiled. And so I think we've seen some positives there, but it comes against a period when, in fact, if you look at the United States, patience has run out with China. So at the same time, China is starting to tone back the wolf warrior rhetoric, trying to get back out into the world and, get some sort of resumption of a new normal. It's at a time when Ukraine is happening, comments about what's happening with China's role with Russia, and a whole pile of potentially really major retaliatory moves to come out of the United States against China, on top of the ones that have already been taken. I mean, we cozy up to the United States and we talk about the US as being one of the major authors of, the peace dividend of the last 30, 40, 50 years, and the international institutions that have, kind of surrounded that. But the United States has been a real recalcitrant, and we need the United States to step up. But at the moment, it's not doing that, and we have a situation where, right now it's looking at imposing sanctions, more sanctions on China, but this time in relation to steps which have yet to be proven about China's role with Russia in Ukraine, and the intelligence is not keen on that. But I was in Washington in October, and I was absolutely staggered at the depth of emotion and feeling against China, far more so since January 2020, which was the last time I was there pre-COVID. And at that stage, they'd done the Inflation Reduction Act underway, the CHIPS Act underway, the barriers were coming up, US was becoming much more industrial policy in its own country. But at the same time, you go and talk to organisations like the US Chamber of Commerce, and they said, well, that's only part of what's likely to happen, because they had been briefed by the White House that other sanctions would be considered later. And this poses a bit of an issue for New Zealand, because the sanctions that we signed up to with Russia were pretty much cookie-cutter sanctions, right off the back of the US Treasury. I do not believe that we had the intelligence of this country and the capability to come up with that list of names and all the issues where they were perceived to have breached various norms internationally, and the oligarchs and so forth. But if it goes to expansion to be against China, and where the US goes out and rallies the troops with the G7, then it becomes a question, where do we sit in all of that? And I think that's a big question, and I have no idea what the answer is, but it scares me, frankly.
Thank you, Fran. Charles.
Hey, well, good afternoon, and thanks for having me. Maybe the best place to begin is just a word of warning. I have never felt so uncertain about our future in my adult lifetime. So normally by now I'd be telling my clients who's going to win the New Zealand election. I would be pretty confident knowing where the US politics was heading. I would understand the operation of global financial markets. I understand nothing right now. Nothing is behaving the way it should. And we're in a period of real change in terms of major power relations. Fran's already alluded to Australia trying to improve relations with China. Actually, I think the Biden administration wants to improve relations with China too, and China wants to improve relations with the Biden administration, but no one knows quite how to do it. So it's a really challenging time to be thinking about the New Zealand-China relationship. But just on the United States, it's amazing that probably the world's most divided politics agrees on one thing absolutely, and that is that China is bad and that China is the threat. That really complicates life for us enormously. There are some things that are pretty obvious. China is going to remain our major market for many years. It's interesting listening to John's reference to the pat of butter. When I first served in Beijing in 1992, it was impossible to get the dairy board interested in the China market. At that point, the view was Chinese did not really like dairy products. It was never going to be a major market. That had changed actually by the time I'd left China, but it was a real uphill battle. And the meat industry said, oh, Chinese people don't like eating sheep meat. Well, in both cases, China is by far our biggest dairy market and sheep meat market now. So it's very, very important to keep challenging those perceptions. And on the services side of the equation, I think we will see quite a substantial return to international students. One or two people will be very pleased with that review, and tourists from China. I think the challenge is actually going to be our immigration settings and letting those students back in. But we also should be realistic. China is not going to be growing as an economy as quickly as we have been used to over the last 20 years. Its population has begun an inevitable decline, and over the next 50 or 60 years it's going to halve. It's probably going to, in per capita terms, become much more wealthy, but you know, if you're a producer of infant powder and expect a straight line upwards, you've got a problem. Chinese government is also making increasingly loud noises that the Chinese economy needs to be more self-sufficient in the production of a number of products that we are very good at producing and exporting to China. And there are some real structural challenges in the Chinese economy. We've got a very inefficient SOE sector still, and there's a property bubble that needs to be addressed. We need also to set our relationship settings in the context of those of our major other friends and partners around the world. The United States we've been talking about, but there's actually very strong views growing in the EU about China that we need to be mindful of. UK, we need to be mindful of, and Japan is becoming increasingly independent and assertive in its views and sees China as a problem that needs to be addressed. And in China, too, don't forget that politics is not quite as stable as they would like us to believe. But it's very interesting now that Xi Jinping has secured another 5 years. We are seeing a noticeable change in attitude, a slight easing of some of the rhetoric towards the rest of the world, and a desire to get out there and be a bit more open to dialogue with some that they had not been prepared to talk to. I am really very worried, though, about this view that's formed in the United States and the view that is growing in significance in other parts of the world about China being a real threat. And it all seems to be coming to a head right now around Taiwan and the cross-strait relationships. Actually, that's one thing I'm not really worried about, because there is no way China is wanting to invade Taiwan at present. And they don't have the capability to do that, and they'd be very, very worried about the consequences of that act. I think that one of the problems we face is that the Chinese have kicked out a whole lot of journalists from China, from the US, from the UK and in Australia, and guess where they've turned up? Taipei. They're not needing to produce copy, and the easiest thing to write about is the cross-strait tensions. And we're seeing much more of this in our media, and unfortunately we still don't have New Zealand media operating in that critically important part of the world for us. We're very much getting a view which is derived from others in that space. A lot of the tension you're seeing between China and Taiwan right now is actually not about China and Taiwan. It's about China and the Democratic Progressive Party in Taiwan, which is in power. You're seeing already a dialogue between the KMT leadership and the Chinese government. If there's a change of president in Taiwan in a year and a half's time, you'll see a noticeable cooling in the rhetoric and a changed posturing. Don't forget that China and Taiwan, as recently as 2012, were negotiating their own free trade agreement. Fell down because of people flows and services regulations, but they were doing things that people previously thought would be unthinkable. So look, we need to, as John has been indicating, have as good a possible relationship, a broad relationship with China that extends beyond economics and trade. The view that we can just ignore things we don't like and just focus on trade and investment, unfortunately, is naive, and I don't think can be the way we operate in the future. But there are things that we agree on, and there will be things we disagree on. We need to have a mature relationship. If we disagree with something, we can say it. If China disagrees with something we do, they can tell us, and we should get used to those differences. But we really need to be putting a lot of effort into looking for those opportunities where we are on the same page. I think climate change actually is one where we can work very closely together. And actually, even though they have broken a few international rules recently in the trade space, I think China at the end of the day does believe in the rules-based international order, and we can work with them on strengthening that. I do worry what would happen if Trump comes back, because he is already talking about even more tariffs than he had before, and goodness knows what that's going to mean for our situation. So as New Zealand business people, if there are still some in the room, please take a really close look at what's going on, but be very sophisticated in your analysis. It's not a binary thing, either or. There's a lot of nuance. Try and understand it, and I do think we can navigate our way through by investing a lot more in the relationship.
Kia ora, Charles. Thank you. I'm reflecting on the last couple of days and then this session. If you were to have sat in this room as a visitor to New Zealand and you were trying to understand New Zealand's position facing out into the world, you would quickly realise, well, actually, a lot of politics is domestic. And so some of the things we project out into the world are a reflection of the realities. Many of us have a surface level understanding of China. Some have a very deep understanding. But John, I'm going to go to you, and then I've got other questions I'll bring back to Charles and Fran. What are we maybe not seeing that's happening within China that would help explain their role in the world, that will be less obvious to an audience that understands some dynamics, reads, where it's a well-informed audience, but if we're not close China watchers, what's actually happening on the inside that leads to those projections?
So, should I give an hour lecture or just... I mean, I think it is challenging, but and Charles actually alluded to some of the challenges which China faces, which are demographic, which are environmental, which are also economic. So in some ways, getting a realisation that China is not immune from the sort of challenges that our societies face is quite important. Secondly, scale. I mean, you talked about the fact that the population's going to halve. Well, it will still be, even if it halves, and I'm not sure it will halve as dramatically as that, but it would still be 600 million people, or possibly 700 million. I mean, you're still talking about a lot of people, and that's possibly something which is rather hard for us to grasp. I used to get into, well, not trouble in China, but those of you who've studied Asian languages will know they use the unit of 10,000 as the means of counting, which means to translate from that into our form of counting always creates problems. So I used to say we have 4.5 million people, which we did then, and you could see people, no, he actually means 45 million. And then I would say, and we have 27 million sheep, and he'd say, he means 2.7 million, because they couldn't comprehend a country which had 4.5 million people and 27 million sheep. I mean, maybe we can't comprehend it either, so there are those differences which are extremely sort of self-evident if you're living in China, but not so evident if you're coming from here. The final one I would simply mention is the role of the Communist Party. I mean, we've, as been talked about a lot in the course of the last 2 days, we live in a liberal democracy. We have free speech, we have freedom of religion, we have freedom of all sorts of things. It's a very different proposition in China. And this is not making a commentary about, which system is good or which system is bad. It's part of the reality of China, that party controls what happens in that country, and it has done so since 1949. So this is not some sort of flash in the pan. This is something which is deeply embedded in the way China operates. And that's an important thing for people to bear in mind when they move to China and do business there.
Thank you. I'm going to, there have been quite a few questions that are coming in that relate to our relationship with China, China's relationship with the West, which is the centre here, and our relationship with others. So I might start with you, Fran. You've just been in the States, you talked about that. How realistic is it for us to navigate an independent foreign policy as separate from traditional allies?
Oh, I think it's absolutely essential. I think when you see the two elephants play, you never know when they're going to kiss and make up, and you can get on the wrong side of things. And we have even seen with Australia, I think we were quite wise not to go too far down into the Australia, attempt to fight back against China's coercion, because in some ways, given the nature of the beast, they kind of provoked it anyway, and they had missteps, which the current Prime Minister has acknowledged carefully, and that's kind of getting back on the road again. I think we've got to be careful not to go to a party to which we're not really invited, and we need to be very careful about that. But at the same time, I think we still have to stand up for democratic ideals. So if there are issues within our own country where we've seen, Chinese media coming under pressure, Chinese population here, we need to stand up for that not to happen. And so, there's tension there. But it's interesting. I mean, I had a very long conversation with two people who came back from China this year, having gone back during COVID, not been able to get back, having had ageing relatives and in China that they wanted to, pay attention to, look after out in the provinces. And it was sort of essentially around what are the conversations around China that aren't necessarily at the top of the CCP and all of that. But, in terms of Taiwan, which Charles mentioned, what do Chinese really feel about going to war? Do they really want to lose 1 million people or so if they go into a war to which they're not military prepared for? So people are talking about this. New Maoism, do they really want Xi cast in the role of a modern Mao? The kind of invisible hand of the market guided by the visible hand of government, and that kind of syndrome there. Young people, do they want a democratic future, or do they want to have a more nationalistic future? And the other one theme that seemed to come through was about business innovators. Can they actually build a future in China now, or will they have to go offshore? And the case was made about Jack Ma, who's been holding out in Tokyo because things are not comfortable for him at the moment. And he's the founder of Alibaba, who had the world's largest IPO pulled by the Chinese government because it was a threat to the financial system. So, the boundaries have gone out, and some of their business people, when you look at some of the studies coming out of China and the US, I mean, they are leapfrogging in some elements of technology, the United States, and this would have been seen unthinkable a few years ago. So, there's this rising power is kind of pressing out there, but I think we have to treat China with respect. I think we have to treat the United States with respect. And I would hope that as we normalise via getting out into the world, seeing each other again, business missions going back into China from the US as well as New Zealand and everywhere else, that we can establish some norms that take down, the tension a little bit. And I think that's really important.
Thank you. I'm going to come to you now, Charles. There's a question that's come through, and it was general, but it's, I think, particularly applicable. You started your comments by saying, look, it's very hard to know what's going on, and yet people come to you for advice on some of these matters. What advice do you give given that uncertainty? Because it's a theme of this conference, the world is complex, saying it's too complex isn't really an option. What advice would you give either to policymakers and politicians or to businesses in how to think about China at this time?
Well, in terms of the business, I actually was asked to talk to a quite major international board that was meeting in Auckland recently, and they were really interested in New Zealand-China relations. Their big question was, is New Zealand going to be treated the same way Australia has been treated by China? Are we going to fall into that trap? And my advice was I would be very surprised. I think there's a huge difference between our settings and Australian settings. You can't discount the possibility that some politician will say something that China really doesn't like, and then they'll whack us around the ears and using trade as their mechanism. But I'm reasonably confident that will not be the case. And we've talked a lot about actually the fact that New Zealand policymakers can't make decisions independent from what's going on in the wider region and globally, and so it's really putting probably much more effort into understanding those geopolitical tensions than we probably are used to as New Zealand boards. And if you can't do it in-house, and I think you can actually do a lot in-house, get that expertise in every 6 months or every year when you're having your strategy sessions, build geopolitics into your discussion, and make sure you have a really good risk policy as a board, and you're taking decisions with a full understanding of the risks you're taking. I'm pretty comfortable overall with our level of trade dependency on China, but there are certain industries that are very dependent. I hope they've got a plan B and a plan C.
One of the plan B, plan C options has come through in a question around if China were to align more closely with Russia, what then? So, to any of you, would anybody like to grab? Wait,
take a frigate out.
you go, Fran, first.
No.
And I think the first thing is, do we think that's likely? Let's not, completely, shoot.
Well, I think China's playing very carefully at the moment because, if you look at just the rhetoric over the last few days, the meeting with the Belarus president and so forth and so on, and some sort of indication of wanting to see not quite a peace plan, but the first steps toward it. And the US obviously feels that doesn't go far enough, and they may well be right. But but China has sort of not really come out on this issue until about now. It doesn't go as far as where politicians like Jacinda Ardern, had remonstrated with Xi at APEC last year about, use your influence in the UN and elsewhere on this, and they have been allies over a long time. So it's difficult, but we'll just have to wait really to see how it plays out. But I think just all bets are off, aren't it? If they do seriously get into bed together, then it does come into that question about if it's a major challenge to world peace, where do we sit? And, as one cynic said to me the other day, and it might even have been me, that in some ways you need to have a war to create the new peace dividend. And that's a terrible way of looking at it. But this is also a view that, you kind of hear in the United States and some of the think tanks around the hill. You hear an element of that coming through on China's side as well. And Chinese people, particularly I think within the realms of the party, when you talk to people who are on the fringe of all of that, I mean, they do actually see this as a potential that there may be, a major dust-up of some sort, and then after that, the new bones of a new world order might emerge or not. Yeah, we don't know.
Can I jump in on this one? I think that China initially misplayed their position over what Russia was going to do to Ukraine, and suddenly realised they'd made a mistake and have become much more careful. I think the Chinese view was that the West was impossibly fractured, wouldn't come together, and that Russia would romp home and take a lot of Ukraine real fast. And that hasn't happened, and they've learned a lot from that, and both in terms of wider diplomacy and international structures, but also militarily they're learning lessons all the time. I think New Zealand business should be watching what's happening very closely, because at the end of the day, I see huge potential for China to be benefiting enormously from the fact that they're not sanctioning, they've still got a commercial relationship with Russia. They will be investing more in Russia in due course. And Russia's got an awful lot of dairy product, an awful lot of meat, and an awful lot of trees and fish. So we could see China coming out of this with a very interesting dividend, not necessarily a peace dividend, but commercial dividend, and it wouldn't be necessarily aligning with the interests of many of our companies. Watch this space.
Well, I'm going to take refuge in the politicians thing, which is I don't answer a hypothetical question.
Brilliant.
But no, I mean, I think I would agree with Fran. I think China is acting very carefully. I think this was alluded to earlier today, and I would imagine it's got very mindful its set of equities with all sorts of countries over the world, including Russia.
Can I zoom right back, maybe a broader look at time here? Somebody earlier today mentioned the sort of Francis Fukuyama. There was a view of end of history, that most countries are moving towards democracy, capitalism. This was the drift. Samuel Huntington, same time, releases Clash of Civilizations, that no, this is not going to work out. Huntington wins. Fukuyama says, yep, got it wrong, is the simple synthesis. But are we looking at actually a return to norms where we've been in an unusual period of calm? Tim Grosser at this forum last year talked about Pax Americana. There's been a liberal ideology that has been able, or a liberal system maybe, that's been supported by America's wealth and military might. And actually this is more a normal situation where there are vastly different views of the world between superpowers, and we should expect that, and as a smaller country, we'll be wedged between those elephants at some time. John, any views?
Well, I think you've got to be a bit careful not to conflate the current state of affairs with a more permanent shift, because the world operates differently now from what it did, say, before World War I. I mean, we just, for instance, had the G20 foreign ministers meeting in Delhi, I think it was, a few days ago. Now, that sort of thing, which put, a slightly obviously uncomfortable, interaction between the Russian and the American foreign ministers, that could not have happened before. And the fact that you've got those sort of institutions and those sort of arrangements means that whatever is going on internationally is in a very different space, a very different framework from what it was. On the other point, about where are things heading, I mean, this is perhaps slightly parenthetical to your question, Matt, but I think whatever is going to happen in China will happen because Chinese people want it to happen. It won't happen because somebody outside says, well, we think you're heading in such and such a direction, and therefore in due course, your political system will catch up with your economic system. I just don't think that that's the way it's going to be, which is not to say there mightn't be changes, but there'll be changes which will be generated internally rather than externally.
Thank you. Any other views? No, I'll keep going. There are several questions here around trade relationships, and one question was that there are obvious, a common refrain in board risk sessions and so on is around diversification, and there are some obvious limits to that at the trade level, or downsides and trade-offs in that. How might businesses and organisations think about diversification, partnership, but also maintaining strong and respectful relationships with China?
Can I answer that, because I'm going to have to catch the airplane in a few seconds. Or get to the airport anyway. I think the problem is not diversification in the markets. We can sell everything we want to sell. It's the price that we are receiving, and the problem we face, which is a good problem to have right now, is that China is prepared to pay top dollar, and we can't match that. But it was very interesting in the early stages of COVID when we did lose the Chinese market for 6 weeks or so for certain products. We were able to shift pretty quickly. Indonesia, some other markets. Sri Lanka took a lot of dairy. Unfortunately, it's not able to afford that right now if we have to do it again. But there are other markets there. The problem is price, which is why New Zealand companies should be doing the sensible thing, which is trying to maximise returns, but always have a view to what happens if things go wrong. And it's not just a political risk; it can be an economic risk, and there could be another COVID. John mentioned water before. There's a huge problem in China. Some years of a drought, that's got much wider implications. Anyway, I'm sorry, I have to go. Thank you very much.
No, thank you, Charles. Any last comments before we wrap up?
No, just going to pick up on the trade point. One of the things that is quite interesting, in July, New Zealand will host the CPTPP Commission, and that is, kind of the regulatory body of ministers who get together annually and make sure the comprehensive whatever, the old TPP it was, that's operating professionally now. The United Kingdom is just ready to join that, and China and Taipei are also in the queue. And so one of the strategic decisions we have to make is, will we as chair help to facilitate that or not? And it's really interesting that China is choosing to try and become part of that, whereas the US, which was one of the originator countries, has not done so. At the moment, Japan, which is a bit of a proxy for the US in this debate, is basically saying, they're not so keen on that. Prime Minister Lee in Singapore is keen on that. He sees it as a way of kind of enveloping China in a new kind of, basically keeping them in the tent. And you have to remember also, with the Regional Economic Comprehensive Partnership, China is also part of that. So in some ways it is in sub-clubs, and then there's the potential to bring it into another club. It also, like the United States, wants to be part of setting the rules of business for the next little while. So there are issues there. There's obviously data, a whole range of issues, but they had the NDRC out here a couple of years ago, and they were basically studying what would be the preconditions for China to come into this, and would it be an element of modernising its own economy. So, there's things there which are actually potentially optimistic in the long run.
I was about to end on exactly that note, the word optimism. So, a last question to both of you before we close. What do you see as the greatest opportunities for us in this relationship as we navigate it forward?
Well, I think the greatest opportunity is simply that there is going to continue to be a large group of people in China. It may not be quite as large as we thought, but a large group of people in China who are interested in purchasing what we supply, whether that's food, whether that's scenery, whether that's English language education or whatever. And I think that is going to continue to be a key ingredient in New Zealand's economic future. Now, it won't only be China, though every other country in the world is sort of in this business as well. But I would see that as being a place where we should put some effort, and by doing so, we do need to have a robust political relationship with China at the same time. But I think we can manage that. I mean, I said earlier this is going to be a difficult challenge, but I do think we can respond to it.
Kia ora, thank you. Fran?
Gosh. Look, I think it is New Zealand continuing to have a voice at the table to develop people-to-people connections further than we do, and particularly as we are now coming out of COVID. I think the Māori business community shows extraordinary leadership in this regard. Often, the question comes up, and various people, Paul Morgan and others, are quite vocal, kind of asked about what might be happening on human rights in China, and says, well, guys, look closer to home in New Zealand, what happened to our human rights? Trade is a great equaliser, and I think it's a great way of connecting. And when you have, commerce between countries, it helps to set up the preconditions for peace, in my view.
I agree. All right, look, I will leave it there because I'm conscious that we promised we would get people out at 1:30, and so I'm just going to thank you both, and Charles and Stentia, for a, Hamilton Airport waits for no one, and for a fantastic session. I really appreciate your insights. Kia ora.
Thank you.